green, what does green mean? That word lends itself to greenwashing. The wind catchers, like passive heating, passive cooling, like all that stuff we've been doing forever without technology. So I just come back to that. Just being really aware of where it's coming from, the climate considerations, and the local community and what's available. Are we another big one is, are we utilizing local labor? A lot of times we're not incorporating local businesses, and I think that doesn't feel quite right.
Oh, hello and welcome to another episode of Tiny Farm Friends podcast. Our guest today is Christina Ransbury. She's an artist, an architecture designer, an interior designer, but more importantly, a dreamer who thinks that this world could become a beautiful example of what humans are capable of. And if you follow her on Instagram, you might have seen her aesthetic but very informative design diagrams on building using passive solar strategies and climate specific architecture. I am already a big fan of her work and find it really inspiring. So, thank you, Christina, for joining us on the podcast. But I would request you if you could take a couple of minutes to maybe share your story with our listeners.
Yeah, thank you, Ragav. I'm so excited to be here and just talking with you, and I'm excited that this my diagrams have been kind of taking off and people have been finding them useful. I've been mostly an architectural designer in the past. I've always been an artist, but I really started architectural design early on with my grandpa. He was an artist, and so I did a lot of paintings with him, and he did a lot of work where it was just a house and, like, a idyllic setting, or a boat on the water, very very fanciful type drawing. So that's really where I got the love for a building and its placement in nature. And he taught me a lot. He taught me, all sorts of stuff. But that's where I started to draw little houses, and since then I've just kept drawing and drawing houses. So it's been something that's definitely close to my heart. And and so I did want to go to architecture school, but I ended up going to interior design school
Yeah.
because I felt that there was a need for more, like, let's use what we have. And my perspective on that later changed, but it was a great starting point because it taught me how to start drawing architecturally. And so I've always been an entrepreneur, and I continued my journey um where I would just start working with architects, under architects, just because I wanted to learn. And so then I just started doing my own work and getting my own clients along the way, and at the same time learning natural building, going to all these workshops. And so that's kind of where I am today, focusing on natural building and marketing.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing your story. And to understand more, what you talk about usually is building resilience and achievable sustainability. So I would love to know your thoughts about that. What do you mean by building resilience and achievable sustainability?
Yeah. So achievable sustainability is something that I've more recently started talking about. But when I talk about resilience, I think it's something that we really need to come back to, because we're building, you'll see all these different modalities in the quote green building world, with passive house or living building challenges, a little bit more holistic, or lead. But we're not really looking at, like, hey, what if something breaks down? Like, do we have backup systems in place, or are we simply relying on these mechanical systems? And I think um, technology is wonderful and great, and I think we should be utilizing it to advance us. But what are some other things that we're not thinking about that we've been using since the beginning of time, like all these passive strategies that that the ancient wisdom has? Like, how can we merge them? And so, like the wind catchers, like passive heating, passive cooling, like all that stuff we've been doing forever without technology. So I just come back to that. And also in a time when the climate is rapidly changing, it's good to think about how durable our buildings are. How are we making sure that they're not just flimsy things that are going to blow away in the wind? So
Right.
durability, backup systems, different things like that, passive systems, I think are really important when thinking about nature oriented solutions. And achievable sustainability is it's when we see the natural building community, I think a lot of where people get a little hung up on is the purist mentality. We want to think about embodied carbon, we want to understand the materiality we're using, but we also have to recognize that in some situations, in some places, it makes sense to utilize the local materials. And if that doesn't happen to be the purest of what we've got, it's what we've got. And so I think instead of importing something or trying to be so purist, I think we have to make trade-offs. And we're constantly making trade-offs in life. And so just being really aware of where it's coming from, the climate considerations, and the local community and what's available. Are we another big one is, are we utilizing local labor? A lot of times we're not incorporating local businesses, and I think that doesn't feel quite right.
Those are some really interesting points and some questions that we need to ask as designers, especially. And you actually brought up quote unquote green building. So I also would
Yeah.
love to talk more about that. So, what do you think? Like, how are green buildings different from, say, natural buildings? And I've always, been a little bit skeptical after my stint as a conventional architect when it comes to, with all these certifications, because
Mm.
even though their intentions might be right, I feel that the legislations are not quite holistic, if I could say, if not incomplete,
Right.
because it looks more like a makeup or cover up, like once you do after you build using like concrete and that lot of embodied energy already. So what are your thoughts on these kind of certifications, and do you think green building is different from natural building?
Yeah, absolutely. All of them are different. But I just want to back up and say, like, green, what does green mean? I mean, that that word lends itself to greenwashing because it doesn't mean anything. You're
Right.
just naming a color. I if you say sustainable, that makes a little bit more sense. It's like, okay, well, this is going to be some kind of give back reciprocal type relationship just in the name. So when I hear green, I immediately I'm turned off. But I'll just break down like maybe the top four certifications and just like explain what I think about them. Like the hardest to achieve is the Living Building Challenge through the Living Future
Okay.
Institute, and that is a holistic system um, where they go through all different types of a building and its relationship to the community, the land, and all of that. And it's really hard to achieve. Um, and in that way, I come back to achievable sustainability because I'm like, well, why aren't more of these being created? What is the bottleneck in this? So that's a little bit of a drawback with that one. The next one is passive house, which is that's talking about amping up the envelope, like high insulation, air barrier, all that. But it doesn't imply that you're using natural or low embodied carbon materials. So it's weird. They're high efficiency, but you could be using a lot of plastic and like just garbage materials. And so I get a little frustrated when I'm talking about passive systems and people bring up passive house because it's a totally different thing. Passive solar and passive house are not the same in terms of regulation and standards. So there's that. And then lead is just, it's basically just like a checkbox. You're just checking boxes like, oh, you did this, oh, you did that. Here you go. Here's a, you know, a certification. But I don't think that any of those incorporate natural building as much. And so it's a little bit of a bummer that we're not seeing more of, a standard around that. And then there's well. Well is kind of cool because it's all about the occupant. It's the health of the occupant. It's the air quality. It's the light coming in. All those things. So that one's pretty achievable, but it's not looking at what materials you're using or anything else like that. So yeah,
Right. I think what you mentioned, green as a color, like I was also guilty of doing all those things. I remember while working as a conventional architect, what you used to do is, like all this, what you see now with
yeah,
so-called super architects firms, that you're pushing and pulling some stuff and then you're putting trees on every floor and then calling it like green architecture. So, I mean, I
yeah,
am quite, I would say, like lucky to have got that awakening somehow that this is not really green what you are trying to achieve, even though we were making, platinum certified buildings. But by going through the whole process, I realized it's just, as you mentioned, just a checklist. And somehow, if you go deeper, it also feels like somehow companies are also selling their greenwashed products through those checklists.
right.
So it
Because
was
it's trendy,
one
and
of
they're like,
the,
well, maybe we'll
right,
get some write-offs or something.
right,
I don't know. Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. It's unfortunate. I think that natural building, there's also people get irritated by the word natural. There's all these little words that because they say, well, what's natural? How at what point do you draw the line and say it's man-made? So that one's a kind of a tricky one, and I think that the natural building movement doesn't get the best rap because it's not necessarily fully to code and modernized, and people don't, they're like, well, it's a mud house. It might just, fall to the ground. And so kind of demystifying some of those things, like there's maybe 6 or 7 different types of natural building methods that are actually in the IRC code. So as appendixes, but uh, so I think we're slowly coming around, but I think we need to market it better. Maybe use better words, and show how simple some of these systems are, and how it's very, very accessible.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's why I really appreciate your work. What you're doing is because you're trying to, through your diagrams and through your like informative posts, actually improving the desirability of natural houses. And that's what I think the community also needs. And in India, like how it is right now, is that they have been labeled, as you rightly said, we should use the right words. So they have
Mm,
been labeled, there are words, like in Hindi, it's like pakka and kacha. Pakka means permanent. So they are like, seen with like concrete structures, brick and cement structures, and the mud
yeah.
structures are seen as weak, or it has become an equivalent status of poverty, even though like a quarter of the world still lives in those kind of houses for centuries. But
Right.
maybe I think
Right.
the problem is they're not well designed, I feel. Like, like some.
Yeah. Well, it's just interesting. It kind of reminded me of a story. A friend of mine who was working in Africa, and she was installing earthen floors and different things like that. And she had built up this business, and a lot of the people were working for her, became pretty well off through the business. And then they decided at the end to just go out and build their own homes with concrete. So it's what's happening is more of like a psychological issue. It's not really that it's not a good system. It's that people perceive natural building as something for, the less well off, or, and then the concrete is like this technology that, is going to stand the test of time, all this stuff. So it's really breaking down some barriers within our own perception of what it is, and bringing more examples to the world that you can't say no to. You're like, well, this is this is efficient, it's durable, it's passive, all those things. So yeah, we just have to be better at showcasing it, for sure.
So, how is the situation in the US, and do you think this natural building movement is actually gaining popularity? And if yes, in which particular group of people is it gaining popularity?
Well, I've noticed, so when I moved back from Maui, I moved to Colorado here, and I started working with compressed earth blocks, so helping design those types of buildings. And a lot of the people that were coming, you know, through Colorado Earth and through who I was working with, they were concerned about fire. So I think as people are experiencing climatic changes, they're more inclined to go in a natural direction because that gives them the most durability that they need. So building with earth in a place that's prone to fires is, a great solution. So I've been seeing it more in that regard, and maybe utilizing that as a pain point for people to recognize, like, hey, like rising sea levels, different things are happening. Like, do you want to just, invest in a home and then all of a sudden you're wiped out? Or do you want to build a property that's going to be resilient, have all your needs met, not to be a doomsdayer, but to be prepared, and to make good choices and investments. So I think that's what I've been seeing. But there's like a couple different um, types of movement even within the natural building movements. Some people are really beholden to their certain materialities, like straw bale or um, cob or something. So uh it just depends on what kind of group you're in, where you can kind of see like what their psychology is around natural building, because it's very different for everybody. Yeah.
Right. I think that's a very fresh perspective, which I did not know that they're switching because of the fires. Yeah, I wanted to know from your perspective that how much do buildings affect human emotions and well-being, apart from the energy side of natural building?
Well, I would speak from my own experience here, because I can say that I'm the type of person where my environment really affects me. And I've taken a survey on this to see where people kind of land, and it definitely is a little bit more all over than I had thought. I thought, oh wow, people are not as affected as me. Um, but I do think that there is like another subconscious layer of that, where they may seem like, oh, I'm tough and strong, but if you're in a room with not a lot of light, you might start to like have effects from that over time. Um, and orientation, I know, like simple things, like kind of back to feng shui, but like if your desk has a door behind you and some people are entering all the time, that's gonna make you eventually start to feel like very vulnerable. So there's different ways of orienting ourselves, even on a site, like where are we placing the building? So people coming in, there's a very clear direction, and a very clear path to where we're going and where the people are, and it's very relational. And so I think that it's very important, and if people don't recognize it as such, I think that there are some underlying energetics, and I think that's happening in the world too, where We may not seem like, oh, well, we don't meditate or we don't do all these things, but if you do start to have these more holistic practices, you start to recognize like, oh, I do feel better when I do this. So I think it's more exposure driven. Yeah.
Yeah, I second the thoughts there because I am also the person who needs a lot of sunlight to feel better. And I think we are just like
Yeah.
plants who love sunlight, like sunflowers.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think spaces do have a lot of effect on your psychology, especially, the kind of spaces, for example, like all these historical spaces that once you enter, you have like a different effect on you. Like there's some kind of mystery about it and some kind of spirituality attached to it if it is designed well. And I
Hmm.
believe,
Hmm.
I believe like these natural building structures are also like living creatures somehow.
And so, yeah, it's fascinating. And when you're actually working with the natural building and you're using clay has negative ions in it, right? And so it's actually absorbing toxins from the space. And so that can be like another little magical quality of natural building that we may not feel right off the bat, but it's happening. And yeah, I think it's pretty cool when you actually step into a building and you can feel the difference. That's a really cool thing for sure.
Yeah, I think you said it right. And last year, whenever I felt a little bit low or anxious, I used to go down to my cob house and just make cob alone or like put it on the wall alone. And it really, of
Oh,
course, like once you get into your like body from your mind, that also helps. But I'd like to believe that cob also absorbs some of the emotions that made me feel heavy. And I think Ianto, the author of The Hand Sculpted House, also talks about this in his book, uh, and also talks about how it actually healed his back problem while making a lot of cob. So it is
oh wow.
definitely therapeutic in that
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah, I think the clay. I think there's something therapeutic. I mean, people put like clay masks on them to um, bring toxins out from the skin.
I think in our earlier times, we used to like coexist as an ecosystem even through houses. And I think permaculture tries to teach that. For example, the houses in the state where I building a house, there used to be stone and mud mortar houses. So they used to leave spaces within the house for
Oh
honeybees to
wow,
enter and make their honeycombs, and they used to harvest
interesting.
the honey in a unharmful way. So, and there were spaces for the birds to come and nest. So I think it also like transforms the energy of the space and ecosystem.
Yeah, and it's interesting a little spin off of that too, where we're really because we love nature so much, we're almost like protecting it and isolating it and creating like these reserves to basically like, don't touch it, we're gonna mess it up. And that may
Mhm.
be true, but in that process, we're losing the opportunities for people to actually be stewards of the land and have that relationship and try to do good by it because I think that the land actually does better when we're working um, with good intentions toward it. And so, yeah, I feel a little weird about nature preserves sometimes. Not to say it's a bad thing, but just um, we're not we're not able to access as much as we were. And if you think about Native Americans and different indigenous people who were actually settled in those areas and now they're not able to or utilize the resources, it's a little bit it feels a little disjointed. But I don't know, that might not be the case in India. I'm not sure how they organize it over there.
I mean, yeah, there are still the rural population is quite in sync with the nature. For example, there are
Hmm.
elephants that cross my like village, and the cob house that we are building actually there was a funny story also. Once when we were building the cob house last winter, we had actually kept the straw inside the house. So the walls were
Oh,
pretty wet and low because it was winters and they weren't drying faster. So in order to take the straw from inside the house, it actually pulled the wet wall with it also. So we had to
oh
rebuild.
no.
So that was a funny case, but it did not like, I think the elephant did not want to harm the house. It just wanted the straw, but yeah, things
Oh my
can
gosh.
happen like that.
That's so cool.
So, so you earlier mentioned that your grandfather was one of your biggest influences when it comes to, like architecture and, take up that. And I believe we both are big fans of like pattern language. So what are some other books that you think has influenced your design thinking process?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a few. Pattern language is a big one, and I do come back to that a lot. Um, but I also find more technical books a little bit more helpful for me. I wouldn't say like maybe a common user, maybe a designer would be interested in like the solar house. There's one called the green home, even though I'm not a big fan of the green. And that was, you kind of have to, it's interesting because you kind of have to stay up to date because there's, innovations that are happening. So sometimes you read an older book and you're like, oh wait, this is maybe outdated now. But there's still like some really, really cool stuff about passive solar and heating in the book The Solar House. I definitely recommend that one. That's one of my go-tos because it has like a lot of different calculations and more technical information. But there's also like some really fun ones I like for the average user. The Barefoot Architect is really fun because it has a lot of pictures in there and you can kind of get to understand some of the concept. I wouldn't use it as like a technical book for, actual building, but that one's fun to get you inspired. Yeah, and then I also read a lot of more mindset business type books to kind of reframe what we're doing and how we're actually making a difference in the world and getting traction with some of these things. And so Simon Sinek, that's a good one. Start with why. Seems like you like that one too. But yeah, there's lots of those types of books, but I won't, we're on a natural building talk, so I won't get into that.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love
Yeah.
to do a podcast on the entrepreneurial side of it because it's a very interesting
Yeah.
topic, like how we should
Yeah, it
approach
is.
that.
I feel like I'm always learning something there.
Yeah.
It's definitely, I feel like being an entrepreneur, you have to be okay with learning things all the time and just diving into the unknown. Like right
Yeah.
now I'm diving into, marketing and I don't know two things about marketing. So I'm learning on the fly, but that's kind of what you got to do. So
Yeah, I mean, I can relate to it because in the last 3 years, even though I might have learned a lot about building a cob house, but it has been more a journey of understanding how humans work. So, like
mm,
relationship with humans, because when you stay in the rural side, you have to like navigate a lot of situations and
yeah.
also changing your relationship with money and how salesy is salesy or because I think that people who are into like like environment sustainability, I can't generalize, but they start by thinking like anti-capitalistic things that capitalism
Right.
bad. So how can we improve that
Right.
and
Yeah,
all
actually
that?
when I went to a natural building conference here in Rocky Mountain Natural Building Conference, and I was talking to somebody and I was explaining kind of like I created this directory. I'd love to get you on there and I'm trying to like kind of sell this essentially, or not sell it, but get it to be more mainstream. And the resistance I got from a few people was very strong. Like, we don't need to sell this. Like, this isn't like I'm like, well, it's not necessarily sales. It's if you really believe in something, it's promoting what you believe and it's spreading the word and it's spreading goodwill. And I don't think that that has to be salesy. I think that there's ways to understand human psychology to get them to say, yes, this is exactly what I want, but sometimes we have a hard time communicating what that actually is. And so I think it's not a sales pitch, it's basically just communicating with like-minded people and getting them to a place where they want to be, their dream outcome or whatever that is, you know? And so I kind of have to back up from that and just recognize that, you know, if you want to make an impact, you got to sell stuff, you know? So,
And yeah, I mean, I also, when I went to the forest, literally, like, because it's a remote forest where we live, I went with the mindset of Henry David Thoreau, like the Walden mindset, that you
yeah,
only need something. So although there is so much that I love about that book, but like every l- life situation is pretty different, family dynamics is different, and you realize you need money for money things. And if you see the sustainability diagram that goes around the internet, there are three aspects to it, like
right,
social, environment, and financial is a big aspect to it. And you might have actually encountered it while managing a 10-acre property. If that is not taken care of, like,
right,
communities go for a toss.
right.
So when we talk about community living, and like, let's buy a land and live with our friends together and build mud houses, but all this needs to be also sorted, like how the community will be and how it will be maintained. And you need like money for money things. That's how it is. And it was a hard learning for me. Like, there's a quite a lot of resistance from my side also, but I'm slowly changing my relationships with money.
Yeah, and it's hard because we've been programmed by our parents and different generations that came before us, and that's a hard one to unravel. But I think if we back up and think about what's possible if we're living in abundance, and what we can give, uh, if we're comfortable asking for more, we're able to give more. It's just reciprocal, and so just kind of coming back to that instead of the scarcity mindset and oh, I'm not enough, I can't ask for X, Y, and Z. It kind of it stifles us, and then as a community, as a network, we're not able to grow. And so I think, yeah, you're right, it's really important. And so I've been doing some of my own work with that recently, and it's interesting how fast you can evolve and shift. And so like just putting in a little bit of work and learning a little bit. I mean, the internet is amazing. You can we
Yeah.
can learn on YouTube anything we want. So I think if we're victims, we can be victims, but we can also be empowered just with a few clicks. So yeah.
Yeah, that was quite profound and beautiful. And as you rightly mentioned, two words, like, maybe we have to move from the scarcity mindset to the abundant mindset, because that's what nature is. Ideally, everything is in abundance, like from
Hmm.
food to everything for animals. It's just maybe we need to work on the mindset.
Yeah, yeah.
And
It's the biggest piece.
yeah, and because we've been talking like finances and money, also brings me to another question. It is also from a financial perspective, but also from a well-being perspective. Why do you think we should build houses and not buy houses, or if you think so in the first place?
Yeah, so that's actually a kind of controversial thing. And coming from interior design, I originally was like, yes, let's rebuild, reuse, and just use what we have. But as we're dealing with the population on the earth is growing, and so we have more people than we have buildings, so we're having this supply and demand issue. I don't, depending on where you are, but I think it's happening globally. And so with that supply and demand, it's just there's just not enough houses. And so as that's happening at the same time, land is becoming more scarce. And so I think that purchasing land is a really good investment at this point, at this juncture in time, because of the supply and demand issues. And then we also get the opportunity to build better houses because if with AI, you know, people are able to snatch up the good deals, no problem. They can make their buck on that. But they're not going to necessarily build the best thing. So if we want to and we know how, then we should be the ones to be doing that. And so I think purchasing land, building and buying or building is better than buying. in this current landscape and time.
Yeah, I think financially that definitely makes sense. Right. And I just wanted to like go back a few steps and talk a little bit more about the
Yeah.
pattern language because it deserves a little bit more time because it is a special book, I believe. And how has been your experience of using it? Because I believe that building with natural materials is one thing, but building beautiful spaces which, like appeal to human emotions is one thing. And Christopher Alexander has been an advocate of building beauty. Even his course is called Building Beauty. And his book really talks about the timeless way of building, that can evoke emotions. So, what are your thoughts on the pattern language and how have you been using it?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think it's really cool, first of all, that that book is a collaborative piece. I mean, Christopher Alexander put it together, but I think that there was, um, a lot of college students and different
Right,
professors
right.
involved in that book, and so I think that's kind of the magic of it. I also really did love how it started with community planning, before it even got down to the minute of the building, because I think that's so important, and I really did find value in that, where they just started so broad. They just said, hey, like, a government should only be this size in order to be able to function. And I can so relate to that when you see all of our political issues that are just so far away from our local communities. And so that I really resonate with, building these smaller communities. Yeah, and just the way that we utilize the land and the hillsides, and maintaining the valley lands or the flatlands for agriculture, all of that makes so much sense. A couple of the patterns that I feel like I use pretty frequently in my designs are the low sill, which is like bringing our windows a little bit down further. So we're more connected to the outside and we can sit on those ledges. That one I think is really nice. I also tend to use the cascading roofs where, just making sure that it stacks down, just for, it's not only visually appealing, but it feels structurally integral, right? Yeah, and I love also how he talks about the different types of homes, like for different types of people. I think in America at least, we see just the same single family dwellings, 2 bedroom or 3 bedroom, 2 bath type situation, and it just doesn't make sense for it's either that or like an apartment building. But what about, the single person or the couple or the little teenager's little house off to the side? Like we don't see enough diversity in our buildings, and I think that he does a really good job of representing the fundamental philosophies behind all of that and why it makes sense. So yeah, those are a few of my favorites. I do. Oh, the one more that I do like is because I think it brings it back to a spiritual element, is the low door. So having a door slightly lower, so when you go into a room, you're bowing into the room, and there's like an actual recognition of, oh, I'm transitioning now. So that one that one always I don't use it, but it's cool because it brings it back to a more spiritual and probably a more ancient reverence.
Right. I think, yeah, those are some of like really important patterns. And the door one you mentioned, I really, when I ask the indigenous people where I live, they really talk about it in the same sense how you mentioned that it was for that purpose in their old houses, but not anymore. And
Yeah,
I should have actually utilized that in the Cobb house, but somehow I feared people banging more their head because they
right.
have stopped, like seeing things around, and they're usually on their phones most of the time, like
Yeah.
including me. So
It might make sense for like a little nook or a kid's room or
yeah.
something like that. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and for me, some of my favorite patterns are light from two sides because it
Oh,
really
yeah.
uplifts
Mhm,
my mood. The
mhm.
tapestry of light, how we can have, like light coming from different places and how it interplays the shadow. and the fireplace, because I feel like having a fireplace in the house, it is indeed a very spiritual thing. Like when you stare at the fire, there's a lot of introspection going on inside your mind, which is pretty much different, which you would do at any other point. So it is a bit different, I feel. So yeah,
And
some
that's
of
actually a
the
good point because I think actually now with a lot of these green and passive houses is that they're so energy efficient and so thermally tight that you have a fire and then you're like, I'm too hot. Like you can only have it on for a little bit. And so it's a little bit of a bummer in some of these houses they don't recommend having a fireplace, which I
Hmm.
agree with you. Like there is something about having that fire, looking at that fire, the introspection of it, it creates even in the kitchen, you're connected to that element, which I think is important. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, even though I'm not Christian or like in the United States, but I relate so much like the fireplace with Christmas, I somehow
Oh
feel that
yeah.
it's such an
Yeah.
important element. So,
I know. I know. Yeah, it brings
yeah.
people together. It creates warmth. I mean, it's
Yeah.
beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the pattern is also like the fireplace pattern talks about how everybody should get a view of the fireplace and using different chairs and a circular seating arrangement
Oh yeah, the
with
different
the window
chairs. Yeah,
side.
yeah.
Yeah, that's also
Yeah.
interesting one. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that
I
book is quite fascinating.
It is. It is. And I try to keep it nearby so I can flip through it every once in a while because there's so many gems in there. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the book is pretty intimidating, like for people if they see the size of the book, but the way you have to
It's like
go
a
through the,
Bible. It's like a some
yeah,
some kind of ancient script. Yeah. Yeah. But it's
right.
got some pictures. I think that kind of helps.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, this conversation has been incredible, but I'd love for you to like before we end this, like if people are in the process of building their house or like even for designers for that matter, what are some of the questions or advice or tips, very simple ones, that you would like to leave as food for thought for them?
Yeah, well, I think for me, in my journey, it's been a struggle to find the right people to get the projects done. So if you have an idea and you're really wanting to see it come to fruition, I think sometimes it's not about how to do it, it's about who to contact. And who to contact locally to the site that you're building on. And so um, I've been kind of working to solve this problem through my directory, and I think that as designers, as people wanting to move to the country and build something, that it's really coming back to those important parts of collaboration, and knowing you're not alone in it. And so find those people, like you have a network, I have a network, to go on and just find the people and gather a team so that you can make these things happen, because a lot of times you don't know in your local area what materials are available. You don't know a lot of these different pieces. And so I think gathering of the minds is really important, um, because you're not going to be able to have a product that you're really, or not a product, but a home that you're really happy with and satisfied with, if you don't collaborate. So that's just my 2 cents, and it's really simple. It's really just before you start a project, reach out to a bunch of people, ask them if they're willing to consult, ask them if they know of materials in your area. I think that's really all I can say. So I do have that directory started. It's very small, but yeah, I hope that people are able to utilize it. So
Perfect. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. And how can people reach out to you or subscribe to your newsletter? Can you just maybe mention the handles? I'll also put in the description below.
yeah. So it's just cransbury.design at on Instagram, and then cransburydesign.com. So pretty basic, but the spelling, we'll get that all written out down below. Yeah, and
Perfect.
people to use the directory. It's free. It's open source. If anybody has more contacts for it, we'll put them in.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Christina, for doing
Thank you
this
so
and for
much.
doing whatever you do. It was quite enlightening for me. So,
And you as well. Thank you.
I